The First Transcontinental Railroad was a 1,907-mile contiguous railroad line constructed in the United States between 1863 and 1869 west of the Mississippi and Missouri rivers to connect the Pacific coast at San Francisco Bay with the existing Eastern U.S.rail network at Council Bluffs, Iowa. The rail line was built by three private companies largely financed by government bonds and huge land grants. The original Western Pacific Railroad Company between Oakland, Alameda and Sacramento, California. The Central Pacific Railroad Company of California eastward from Sacramento to Promontory Summit, Utah Territory, and the Union Pacific westward to Promontory Summit from the road's statutory eastern terminus at Council Bluffs on the eastern shore of the Missouri River opposite Omaha, Nebraska, opened for through traffic on May 10, 1869, with the ceremonial driving of the last spike with a silver hammer at Promontory Summit. The road established a mechanized transcontinental transportation network that revolutionized the settlement and economy of the American West by bringing these western states and territories firmly and profitably into the Union, and making goods and transportation much quicker, cheaper, and more flexible from coast to coast. Paddle steamers linked Sacramento to the cities and the harbor facilities in the San Francisco Bay until 1869, when the CPRR completed and opened the WP grade to Alameda and Oakland. The first transcontinental passengers arrived at Alameda Wharf on September 6, 1869, where they transferred to the steamer Alameda, which carried them across the bay to San Francisco. On November 8 of the same year, the western terminus of the railroad was changed to Oakland Wharf. Service between San Francisco and Oakland Pier would continue to be provided by ferry. The CPRR eventually purchased 53 miles of UPRR-built grade from Promontory Summit to Ogden, UT, which became the interchange point between trains of the two roads. The transcontinental line was popularly known as the Overland Route after the principal passenger rail service that operated over the length of the line until 1962. History. The completion of a Pacific Railroad marked the culmination of a decades-long movement to build such a line, beginning as early as 1832 when Dr. Hartwell Carver published an article in the New York Courier and Amp Inquirer advocating the building of a transcontinental railroad from Lake Michigan to Oregon, and in 1847 he submitted a memorial to Congress entitled Proposal for a Charter to build a railroad from Lake Michigan to the Pacific Ocean, seeking a charter to build such a road. In 1856, the Select Committee on the Pacific Railroad and Telegraph of the U.S. House of Representatives began its report recommending the adoption of a proposed Pacific Railroad bill by stating that the necessity that now exists for constructing lines of railroad and telegraphic communication between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of this continent is no longer a question for argument. It is conceded by everyone. In order to maintain our present position on the Pacific, we must have some more speedy and direct means of intercourse than is at present afforded by the route through the possessions of a foreign power. Preliminary exploration with strong congressional support and under the direction of the Department of War, the Pacific Railroad surveys were an extensive series of explorations of the American West to explore possible routes for a transcontinental railroad across North America. The expeditions included surveyors, scientists, and artists and resulted in an immense body of data covering at least 400,000 square miles on the American West. These 12 volumes constitute probably the most important single contemporary source of knowledge on Western geography and history, and the value is greatly enhanced by the inclusion of many beautiful plates in color of scenery, native inhabitants, fauna and flora of the Western country, published by the United States War Department from 1855 to 1860. The surveys contain significant material on natural history, including many illustrations of reptiles, amphibians, birds, and mammals. In addition to describing possible routes, these surveys also reported on the geology, zoology, botany, paleontology of the land, as well as provided ethnographic descriptions of the native peoples encountered during the surveys. Despite the over 12 volumes of data produced, there were almost no detailed topographic maps produced over competing routes that would be needed to estimate the feasibility, cost and best route to build a real railroad. One byproduct of these surveys was the purchase of the Gadsden purchase of the southern parts of the future states of Arizona and New Mexico for $10 million. As it was realized, the best southern route lay south of the Gila River boundary in mostly vacant Mexican territory. Fortunately, Santa Anna, president of Mexico, again needed money to pay for his army and was happy to sell some desert. The U.S. Congress was strongly divided on where the eastern terminus of the railroad should be, in a southern and northern city. The Southern Pacific Railroad would start construction after the U.S. Civil War was concluded and finish a southern transcontinental route across the U.S. in 1880. Political authorization and funding. Meanwhile, after years of study, argument, and lobbying by Theodore Judah and others as to where the eastern terminus would be and how construction would be funded, the construction and operation of a transcontinental railroad line was authorized by the Pacific Railroad Acts of 1862 and the even more generous Act of 1864. During the American Civil War, when Southern Democratic opposition in the Congress to the central route near the 42nd parallel was absent, other railroads were also authorized under much the same terms. The Union Pacific Company was incorporated by Act of Congress on July 1, 1862, under the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, which provided for the construction of railroads from the Missouri River to the Pacific. On June 21, 1861, the Central Pacific Railroad of California was incorporated in California. On October 8, 1864, its name was changed to Central Pacific Railroad of California after the 1864 Pacific Railway Act amendment passed that summer. The two newly incorporated railroad companies, the Union Pacific Railroad and Central Pacific Railroad, were chosen by Congress to build and operate the first transcontinental railroad from the Missouri River at Council Bluffs, Iowa, to Sacramento, California, and on to the San Francisco Bay, aided by 30-year U.S. government bonds. Congress, in the middle of a war, set up an ambiguous Union Pacific corporate structure that provided only spotty oversight and ambiguous corporate leadership. It was often unclear who was in charge. These ambiguities allowed the Union Pacific Company to be manipulated by some for extra profits as it was being built. The government-backed bonds were to be issued at $16,000 per mile for track laid at level grade, $32,000 per mile for track laid in foothills, and $48,000 per mile for track laid in mountains. The two railroad companies sold similar amounts of company-backed bonds and stock. In addition to government bonds, a 400-foot right-of-way corridor, etc., on which to build the railroad were made by the Congress. Extensive land grants of alternate sections of government-owned lands along the tracks for 10 miles on both sides of the track, 6,400 acres per mile of track, were also granted to be used and/or sold by the companies. Grants were not allowed or given in cities or at rivers or on non-government property. While some of this land had potentially exploitable minerals, was good farmer forest land, and quite valuable, much of it was essentially valueless desert. Provisions in the Pacific Railroad Acts were made for the telegraph companies, who had just completed the first transcontinental telegraph in 1861, to combine the lines with the railroad's telegraph lines as they were built. Railroad allocated land not sold in 3 years was to be sold at the prevailing government price for homesteads, $1.25 per 1 acre if there were any buyers. Had the bonds not been repaid, the acts provided that all remaining railroad property, including trains and tracks, were to revert to the U.S. government for disposal. The massive amount of capital investment needed to build the railroad was obtained by selling government-guaranteed bonds and railroad company bonds and stock to interested private investors. One of the first subscribers to up stock was Mormon leader and labor contractor Brigham Young. The land grants, financial incentives and bonds would hopefully cover most of the initial capital investment needed to build the railroad. The bonds would be paid back by the sale of government-granted land and prospective passenger and freight income. It was far from a given that the railroads to the thinly settled West would make enough money to repay for the construction and operation for a long time. In addition to the railroad land grants which the railroad sold at low cost to help pay back the government-backed bonds, the 37th United States Congress passed the Homestead Acts, which were several United States federal laws that sold an applicant 160 acres of unclaimed government-owned land, typically called a homestead, at low cost when the applicant did some prescribed work on it. There was now a strong and relatively low-cost incentive for the settlement of the West, which many thousands took advantage of. The railroads started new population growth, and potential population growth induced many other railroads to be built and connected to the Transcontinental Railroad to serve communities and states off the original main track. Most of the engineers and surveyors who figured out how and where to build the railroad on the Union Pacific were engineering college and or United States Military Academy trained Union Army veterans who had learned the railroad trade, keeping the trains running and tracks maintained during the U.S. Civil War, working for the U.S. Military Railroad, which was established by the United States War Department as a separate agency to operate and repair any rail lines needed by the Union Army, as seized by the government from the Confederate States of America railroads during the American Civil War. They controlled over 2,000 miles by the end of the war. Extensive experience building truss bridges was acquired, as many bridges had to be built or rebuilt during the war. Kits and techniques for rapidly building new bridges or repairing old bridges were developed by the remarkable United States Military Academy trained engineer Herman Haupt, who headed the U.S. Military Railroad during the Civil War. Nearly all of the Union and Confederate armies were supported and transported by extensive rail networks which had to be built up, expanded, protected and repaired as the armies advanced and retreated. Most key workers and supervisors were trained by previous on-the-job training and knew what needed to be done and how to direct workers to get it done. Most of the semi-skilled workers on the Union Pacific were recruited from the many discharged Union Army and Confederate Army veterans and emigrant Irishmen escaping poverty and famine in Ireland. After 1864, the Central Pacific Railroad had the same federal financial incentives as the Union Pacific Railroad, as well as some construction bonds that were earlier granted by the state of California and the city of San Francisco. The Central Pacific hired engineers and surveyors who had extensive experience and training building railroads and knew what needed to be done and how to supervise others to get it done. Some were Canadian and British trained. The Central Pacific, facing a semi-skilled labor shortage, relied on some black employees escaping the slavery and turmoil of the American Civil War and many emigrant Chinese manual laborers for construction. Most of these Chinese emigrants were escaping the poverty and terrors of the Taiping Rebellion in the Guangdong province in China. Supervisory, engineering and skilled jobs were done with experienced white workers, including the lot of Irishmen. The Chinese, despite the small stature and total lack of experience with railroad work, handled most of the heavy manual labor needed to get over and through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains and across the Nevada and Utah deserts. In the time period, there was only a very limited amount of work that could be done by animals, simple machines or black powder. Most of the black and white workers were paid $30 per month and provided food and lodging. Higher skilled and supervisory jobs paid more. Most Chinese were initially paid $31 per month and provided lodging. They bought and cooked their own food, just as they desired. In 1867 this was raised to $35 per month after a strike. The Central Pacific R.R. broke ground on January 8, 1863. Due to the relatively isolated location from the manufacturing centers of the East Coast, essentially all of the manufactured railway supplies would have to be transported from manufacturers on the East Coast of the United States, without, obviously, the use of a finished railroad. These supplies included picks, shovels, axes, hammers, saws, sledgehammers, spikes, rock drills, black powder, bridge hardware, iron rails, fish plates, bolts and nuts to bolt the fish plates on, wrenches, railroad switches for the many railroad sidings needed on a one-way track, railroad turntables, steam locomotives, railroad freight cars, railroad passenger cars, telegraph wire, insulators, batteries, telegraph keys, etc. These goods traveled by trains to the East Coast ports and loaded on board ships, which then went on about 18,000 miles and about 200-day trip or about 120-day trip around South America's Cape Horn, or the much more expensive route across the new paddle steamer and Panama railroads crossing of the Isthmus of Panama, about a 40-day trip and twice as expensive per pound of merchandise. Most passenger traffic went via the much faster Panama route. After the goods got to the San Francisco Bay Area, they would have to be unloaded from the ships and put on river paddle steamers for transport over the final 130 miles trip up the Sacramento River to the new state capital of Sacramento, California. The first CPRR track was laid in August 1863 when rail shipments finally reached Sacramento. Many of these steam engines, railroad cars, etc., were shipped dismantled and had to be reassembled in the Sacramento Central Pacific maintenance yards. Ties, construction lumber, telegraph poles, trestle and bridge timbers, and firewood to feed the CPRR locomotives could be sawed and or chopped from timber already in California, Oregon, etc., and transported by ship, wagon and rail to where needed. The Union Pacific Railroad did not start construction until July 1865, due to the difficulty getting organized and obtaining financial backing and the Civil War's need for workers, rails, ties, steam locomotives and railroad supplies. In addition, a railroad can connection to Council Bluffs, Iowa, and the new city of Omaha, Nebraska, had not yet been completed, which made getting equipment needed to start work very difficult. Nearly all equipment and railroad supplies would have to be initially delivered to Omaha and Council Bluffs by paddle steamer up the Missouri River during the summer until rail connections to the east could be finished. The U.S. Civil War ended on June 22, 1865. In the first year, 1865, so little work was done by Union Pacific that they sold 2 of the 4 steam locomotives they had purchased. After the Civil War, competition for railroad supplies to build a new transcontinental railroad while building or rebuilding new railroad nets and repairing and bringing up to date the damaged rail networks in the South initially caused railroad supplies prices to rise. Completion of the railroad and the new homesteading laws substantially accelerated populating the West. Land could now be obtained fairly cheaply, and there was now a much cheaper and faster way to get goods to buy and sell, and widespread markets for those goods regardless of where you lived. The railroads established the equivalent of inland ports. They established the modern state's land highways of commerce and trade, resulting in the decline of territory controlled by the Indian tribes in these regions. The gauge, the distance between the rails of both railroads, was set at what is now called standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 in. The railroad gauge used in the United States were not all standardized at this time, with several different gauges being used. This made transferring railway cars and locomotives to different railways difficult. The gauge of the Southern and Panama railroads were 5 feet then. The rails used were nearly all iron rails of a flat-bottomed modified I-beam profile weighing 56 pounds per 1 yard, 66 pounds per 1 yard. The heavier rails were used in the Sierras, where they made it easier to plow the tracks for snow clearance. Railroad rails were restricted to U.S. manufacturers by congressional fiat. Today's engines in railroad cars are much heavier and use much heftier and stronger steel rails, often continuously welded. By 1865, steel rails had only just been introduced, as the Bessemer process and open hearth furnace steel-making processes started to be established in the United States. For these came steel rails which, at slightly higher prices, lasted much longer than iron rails. They were not used in building the First Transcontinental Railroad, though, which was built as rapidly as possible at as low an initial cost as possible. The advantages of steel rails had as yet not been demonstrated. Upgrades would have to be made in railroad equipment, tracks, ties, bridges, etc. As the railroad became profitable or wore out, within a few years, nearly all railroads converted to steel rails. Not only one of the major initial costs of building a railroad, rails also get a surprising amount of wear and have to be replaced sooner if made of iron, particularly in corners. The iron rail lengths used in building the Transcontinental Railroad are variously listed as 30 feet or 15 feet long. The available pictures seem to favor the shorter length, but the longer rails may have been used if available, especially on curves where the longer length made them easier to bend. Time was not standardized in the U.S. then, but set by each railroad to minimize errors in scheduling its own trains. Only later were standardized time zones set up and time standardized so all the railroads could schedule their trains, later recognized by Congress. Needing rapid communication for ordering more supplies of particular types of workers with specific skills, and needing to schedule the train trains which had to go both ways on a single track. The companies built telegraph lines along the railroad rights-of-way as the track was laid. The close proximity of the railroad made these lines easier to protect, easier to supply with operators for relay at train stations, and easier to maintain than the original First Transcontinental Telegraph lines, which went over much of the original routes of the Mormon Trail up the North Platte River and across the very thinly populated central Nevada route, through the central Utah and Nevada Big Basin deserts. The railroad's telegraph lines, which followed the railroad and were needed to schedule train traffic to avoid conflicts and collisions, soon superseded the earlier telegraph lines in general use. Many of the original telegraph lines were abandoned by the original telegraph companies as they merged the telegraph business with the railroad telegraph lines, just as specified by Congress. For maps and railroad pictures of this era shortly after the advent of photography, see an 1879 tourist guide to railroad travel gives insight to travel in the late 1880s on the Transcontinental Railroad. See the e-book, The Pacific Tourist. The 100,000 square feet California State Railroad Museum at Old Town, Sacramento, California, has an extensive bookstore of railroad reading material and a lot of the original and later Union Pacific and Central Pacific locomotives, cars, etc.